All right, let's dive into a major update on the science and treatment of bipolar disorder. For this explainer, we're going deep into a comprehensive review by Soliman and his colleagues, which was recently published in the American Journal of Psychiatry.
First things first, we need to get a handle on the sheer scale of this clinical problem. Bipolar disorder impacts about 2% of the world's population. But what's really staggering and frankly quite terrifying is the suicide risk. It's somewhere between 11 and 30 times higher than for everybody else, making it the highest among all psychiatric disorders. And to make matters worse, there's this incredible delay in getting a proper diagnosis. On average, people wait about 10 years. Think about that, a full decade.
Okay, so to really get under the hood of this disorder, we have to start with the blueprint, right? We have to start with the genetics.
And it turns out bipolar disorder is one of the most heritable conditions in all of psychiatry. When you look at twin studies, the estimates suggest genetics account for a massive 60 to 85% of the risk. But here's the catch. There's no single bipolar gene. Instead, it's what we call polygenic. That means your risk comes from a whole bunch of different genetic variants, and each one just adds a tiny little piece to the puzzle. And this is where things get really interesting. Many of those same genetic puzzle pieces also show up in schizophrenia. Large-scale genomic studies have found a huge genetic overlap between the two disorders. This finding really challenges those old rigid boxes we used to put diagnoses in. It helps explain why it can be so complex to diagnose and suggests that maybe we should be thinking more about a spectrum of mood and psychosis rather than two totally separate things. So we've got the genetic risk. But the question is, how does that risk actually translate into changes in the brain? Let's zoom in now, from the genes to the actual brain circuits. Thanks to some really advanced multi-omic studies, and that's just a fancy way of saying studies that look at everything from genes to proteins to metabolites all at once, we're seeing these dynamic biological shifts. For example, we see problems in immune and inflammatory systems that actually change depending on whether a person is manic or in remission. And at the same time, we're seeing evidence that synaptic function and how cells produce energy are also off kilter. So all of these different biological clues are starting to converge on four big interconnected areas. First, there's our internal body clocks, our circadian rhythms. Second, it's the powerhouses of our cells, the mitochondria and their energy production. Third is calcium signaling, which is absolutely vital for how our neurons talk to each other. And finally, there's this complex dance between our stress response system, the HPA axis, and our immune system. And these problems at the microscopic level, well, they don't stay microscopic. They scale up and become visible at the level of the whole brain. Structurally, we can see things like gray matter loss in parts of the brain that are crucial for regulating emotions. And functionally, the brain's communication networks are disrupted. The big one is a kind of hyperconnectivity between the emotional limbic parts of the brain and the default mode network, which is the part that's active when we're thinking about ourselves. Okay, so we've got a lot of different biological puzzle pieces on the table. How do we start to put them together into a coherent story of what's going on? Well, the paper proposes two key models that try to do just that. On the one hand, you have what's called the dyssynchrony cascade model. You can think of this one like a line of dominoes. The idea is that the problem starts with a disruption to your circadian rhythms, and that one problem then knocks over the next domino and the next, triggering a whole cascade of issues. On the other hand, you've got the nexus model. This one is less like dominoes and more like a spider's web. It suggests all these systems are interconnected, and a problem in any one spot can send vibrations throughout the entire web. So the key difference really comes down to cause and effect. Is this a one-way street where one thing reliably leads to another in a predictable sequence? That's the cascade model. Or is it more like a busy roundabout where a problem anywhere can affect everything else all at once? That's the nexus model. All right, that's a ton of deep science. But what does it all actually mean for doctors and patients in the clinic today? Let's try to bridge that gap now from the lab bench to the hospital bedside. You know, after all this talk of cutting-edge biology, you might expect some brand new futuristic treatment to be the star. But the paper is crystal clear. Lithium is still the foundational gold standard medication. It works for mania, it works for long-term maintenance, and it has this unique ability to reduce suicide risk. And this is what leads us to a really fascinating clinical paradox. And here is that paradox, in stark numbers. Even though it's widely considered the gold standard, its use has actually been dropping a lot. In North America, prescriptions have gone from almost 28% down to just over 17% in recent years. So what gives? If it's so good, why are fewer people getting it? Well, the paper suggests it's not because of any new evidence saying it doesn't work. Instead, it seems to come down to things like clinicians just not being as familiar with it anymore, having misconceptions that it's too hard to monitor, and maybe overestimating the risks of side effects compared to newer drugs.
So if we ignore the trends for a second and just look at the evidence-based guidelines, what do they actually say? Well, for acute mania, the top-tier first-line options include lithium, quetiapine, and divalproex. When we switch over to the depressive episodes of bipolar 1, the recommendations change, led by agents like quetiapine and lurasidone, usually combined with a mood stabilizer.
Now, this next point is absolutely critical for any clinician or any patient to hear. The guidelines from every major international body are unanimous on this. Using an antidepressant by itself is not recommended, period. Doing so carries a huge risk of actually making things worse. It can destabilize mood and even flip someone into a manic episode.
Okay, we have covered a ton of ground. So let's wrap this up by boiling it all down to the most critical take-home messages and asking that all-important question, where do we go from here?
So if you're going to remember just a few things, make it these. First, bipolar disorder is a highly heritable brain disorder that involves a complex, multi-system breakdown. But, and this is a really big but, there's still this massive gap between what we know biologically and what we can actually do clinically. The lithium paradox is the perfect example of that gap. And that's why the future, the ultimate goal, is something called precision psychiatry, where we can use biomarkers to tailor the right treatment to the right person.
And that leaves us with the big, forward-looking question. As we chase this dream of personalized medicine, where should we be placing our bets? Will the biggest breakthroughs come from targeting our internal body clocks? Or maybe taming inflammation in the brain? Or could the key be rebooting our cells' tiny power plants? Figuring that out, well, that remains the central challenge for the entire field.